Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us this morning on our Coffee with Colleen EDC coffee chat. We are very happy to have Greg McCarry, a local builder and realtor and developer, join us. He's going to be talking about the requirements for housing, which does affect the cost of housing, but it also affects the amount of emissions that are emitted from the housing supply. So just a few housekeeping items before we get going. If you would put your Zoom on mute so that we make sure that we don't have any unintentional background noise distracting everyone. And then if you have any questions, please feel free to either raise your virtual hand or you can put your question in the chat and I'll call on you. And Greg, we like this to be a fairly interactive process. So if you don't mind, I'll bump in if we have some questions so that you can respond to those. So with that, Greg, I will let you take it away. And again, thank you so much for joining us today.
Okay, so good morning, everybody. We're talking about House Bill 1770, which is some modifications to the current energy regulations. Today's regulations are we build under a state energy code RCW 19.27A.020, and that sets forth the requirements that we use to fill out our building applications. Under the current code, the code basically says between the years of 2013 and 2031, we would have incremental improvements in building to achieve a 70% reduction of energy use based on the 2006 Energy Code. So as a practical matter, the way that works is the State Building Code Council does a cycle every 3 years, and they come out with new requirements. And the requirements are set forth in a point system. As an example, if we use a heat pump instead of a regular furnace, we get a point. If we use a heat pump with a water heater, we get a half a point. So this point system is basically developed on an 8-page menu that we get from the state. And we pick and choose from this menu to come up with enough points to qualify the building for a permit. The previous code was 3.5 points, and the most recent code, which was initially delayed due to COVID, is 6 points. So we have to pick from this menu 6 points to come up with a qualifying permit application. The State Building Code Council sets the parameters and they do that. The State Building Code Council is basically a council appointed by the governor, and they're the ones that come up with the formula. Builders, now one of my points is today builders already have to meet the current state requirements to be 70% more efficient by 2030. This new proposal, HB 1770, moves the goalposts by changing the targets and adding some additional new carbon reduction goals. So before I get into what 1770 is, are there any questions about this current system that we're using?
So Greg, I put the link to RCW 19.27A.020 into the chat for anybody that's interested. So, and again, if I can recap, there was a 2006 standard, and then the current code requires improvements over time, and the number of points that have to be created. Is there any association with points to how much less energy usage occurs from a home?
Well, that's a good question. It's basically, um, it doesn't measure it exactly, but what they come up with is the requirements. Now, the State Building Code Council might make some of those calculations, but they're not published in the menu. For example, between the last cycle and the current cycle, we went from an R38 ceiling insulation to an R49. The current code is, for example, in a floor system, we were doing 2x12 floor joists and then packing that with insulation. And now we have to go to a 2x12 instead of a 2x10 because the insulation has to be increased. So they're picking components of the house and saying, if you do more of these things, you get points for achieving that and their objective is to get to actually two things. One is 70% of the reduction in the energy use based on 2006. And also the overall goal is a zero fossil fuel greenhouse emission by 2031. So that's what we're dealing with today.
So it's kind of confusing in that, you know, if you're in a part of the state that's getting their energy from natural gas, or even, I don't think coal's completely eliminated compared to here, where, what is it, 96 or 98% hydro, then you know, have they looked, I mean, I would assume the intention is fewer metric tons of carbon emissions released. Have they, carbon equivalents, have they looked at what this will do to reduce the amount of carbon equivalent emissions for a new house versus a non?
That's one of the complications of the regulations is you have different environmental situations between Western Washington and Eastern Washington. It's colder over there. And some of the things that we use over here don't work. So it's a pretty complicated situation because there's pros and cons that get debated. But as a practical matter, they come up with a solution that they think is going to work and then give it to us. And basically, as I say, it's simple for us because we just pick from the menu and say, this is the point that we get for the building permit. But
and do they,
one of the issues or one of the targets is complete electrification. The state wants to move away from fossil fuels, and propane and natural gas is one of those fuels that they want to eliminate. So if you recall back in the day, in the 80s, the state was pushing natural gas because it was cleaner than electric. Now it's moving the other direction. So having a propane range, for example, could be something that you won't be able to have in a few years.
okay. And so you can't have a gas stove.
Correct.
Will you be able to?
Well, that's where it's headed. You can today, but that's it.
But
the state
if
is headed towards all electricity.
So if 1770 passes, can you do a gas stove?
Currently you can, but it is phasing out.
Okay.
So let's move over to 1770. One of the things when I talk about moving the goalposts, 1770 says that any new building must be net zero ready, including a reduction of at least 80% in the annual net energy consumption based on that 2006 code. That's the baseline. Now, these buildings are going to need wiring and space planning for photovoltaic panels, and under the residential and non-residential state energy codes that are adopted by the council by 2034. So we'll have to, even though that we're not installing panels, we have to be ready to install panels. So today, if this passes, well, by the way, the mechanics, if this passes, it goes back to the building code council, and then the council comes up with the requirements that we're going to have to meet. So it won't get implemented immediately if it passes, but it's coming soon. So if we apply for a building permit under the amended code, we would have to pre-wire the house, let's say for EV, like 2 chargers for electric vehicles, the hardware for connecting solar panels on the roof. It's going to probably require another electrical panel over the existing one. So you'd have 2 panels instead of 1. Right now, I've been trying to chase down the cost of these requirements. BIAW has come up with a cost of $39,500 in order to meet the requirements. Now, one of the issues is if I spend $1,000, I have to put that $1,000 into the house. But then when I sell that house, I have other costs that I have to pay. For example, if I buy $1,000 worth of goods to install, I have to pay about a 9% sales tax. When I sell that product, I have to pay closing costs, which includes an excise tax, sales commissions, escrow fees, etc. I'm going to have to finance that, and I'm going to have overhead and profit built into that. So my $1,000 is going to cost the consumer $1,400. It's just the way it works. So you're putting those components into the house, and you have to account for it. The State Building Code Council is going to define. The legislation requires the Building Code Council to define what net zero ready measures in the code mean. In other words, there's no definition for it today, even though it's stated in the legislation. That the definition is lacking, and that's some of the problems that we have in coming up with an accurate cost. But as I say, BIAW is estimating 39.5. So the assumption under that is, one of the assumptions under that 39.5 is that the entire house is built using fully electric appliances, it's net zero ready, and it's solar ready. So all that infrastructure is built into the house. And the requirement to be solar ready is basically you have to have the wiring set up for it, but you also have to do the space planning in the house. So there would be some adjustments in the design process. There is an option for local jurisdictions to adopt what they call a reach code. A reach code is basically where, let's say a city decides it wants to do its own code and it reaches beyond the existing requirements. The cities would be enabled to do that under this current proposal. Net zero ready is defined by the Department of Energy as a high performance home so energy efficient that all or most of the annual energy consumption can be offset with renewable energy. So that would be solar, wind, or some other renewable feature. But that Department of Energy definition isn't currently adopted by the state, and that's why there's some ambiguity in the current proposal as to what net zero is. So that is basically the big picture. Currently, the House has passed this. It's now in the Senate. There are some modifications that may occur as legislators negotiate, terms and conditions. So what I've sort of recapped here is based on what I know of the latest regulation. So the Senate, basically, it's in their hands. It's still in committee. I don't know when it's going to get to the floor, but that's the big picture.
Great.
So with that, we could have questions.
All right. So when we've got a lot of people on that work in the housing realm, first of all, do you know if this will apply to affordable multifamily housing products, or, you know, what Colleen Robinson works on, Habitat for Humanity, would those homes have to meet these requirements as well as the bill is currently written?
Yeah, this is going to be a building code. So it's a requirement for anything that gets constructed. So the answer is yes. And that's obviously one of the problems. Another thing is, I'm surprised that this would come up right now because we're having enough trouble sourcing materials without having to add more things to a house. You know, there are many things that we can't get readily. And so the supply chain is still impaired pretty significantly. We're probably taking 3 more months to build a house today than we did a year ago, just because, you know, you can't get a garage door. We have a house that's all framed up and the windows aren't coming till July. And so it's going to sit there for 4 months. It's just, so another complication of this legislation, at least currently, is it's adding more things to put into the house that aren't readily available.
So let's see. I know Nathan West, who is the city manager of City of Port Angeles, but also used to run the community development department for the city. So has a deep knowledge as a planner and in the building department area. Nathan, can you speak to this bill? And I, you know, obviously you, unless your council has taken a position, you can't speak to a position, but can you speak more generally to this bill and what you're seeing as your city staff tries to approve different permits that are submitted?
Yeah, thank you, Colleen, and thank you very much, Greg, for your update today. I think this is a really important issue for the city. We have not specifically weighed in on this particular bill, nor am I overly familiar with this particular bill. I know we have at least one council member on who might have more familiarity with that bill. I think it's really important to the city that, you know, we strike a balance. For the city, a top priority is climate resiliency. We're working on a significant climate resiliency plan and have an upcoming meeting on March 16th for public input on that plan. Simultaneously, a top priority for the city is affordability of housing. And we know very much as a community, we can't afford to see costs go up. And so obviously what Greg has shared as far as costs, that's very concerning. And we need to find ways to build incentives that get us to where we need to go, as opposed to create more costs and barriers to affordable housing. And that's a significant issue. I think the biggest concern that we've talked about quite a bit as a city is the pace at which the changes to the state building code are actually coming forward. The every 3-year approach is not something that we as a city can afford to keep up with, nor do we feel the local development community can keep up with that 3-year pace. I mean, literally, we're being asked to change the building code every 3 years, keep track of all of those changes and pass along those requirements to individuals trying to create housing units in this community. And that's a really difficult place to be. I think ultimately that's something we have discussed already with our legislators, and hopefully we'll see some changes that reduce the frequency of that and some of the other regulatory requirements coming our way. But it is important to strike that balance, and I look forward to learning more about this bill.
Thanks, Nathan. When I worked at the Washington Business Alliance, one of the big things that we felt was important to do was to analyze different policies to determine how much carbon emission reduction certain things, certain actions would achieve. And I readily admit, I just don't know if there's been analysis done on this bill, because certainly the impacts of the costs associated with the housing are being evaluated. On the flip side, you're talking about balance here. On the flip side, how much carbon emissions will this reduce? And that's where, if the state hasn't done it, I would think that would be something that really needs to be done, because you want to get the biggest bang for your buck, basically. And we have, certainly on the western portion of our state and in our county, a very good electrical system, in that it's not very carbon intensive, because it's hydro primarily, and it's going to net zero. So I just don't know if that makes a whole lot of sense, especially if you have to install solar panels, but you live on a property where there's a line of trees behind you, and you never have any sunlight on your rooftop, or somewhere. It just, I don't know, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me.
Yeah, we talked about that at the last BIAW Legislative Policy Committee meeting. You have roof design impacts, you have trees. For example, I'm building a home right now on 5 acres. It's in a little meadow, but it's surrounded by tall firs. It wouldn't make sense to put solar panels on that house unless you cleared all the trees away from the perimeter. So there are issues that make solar panels totally inefficient. If you look at Squim, for example, I see houses being built on the north side of the hills over here, the mountains, and some of them are in the shade in the winter. And even if you have a sunny day, it's not going to be effective. So that's just one of the practical issues that the code pursuit is affected by.
So I see Colleen Robinson's on with us. Colleen, has Habitat for Humanity talked about this House bill?
Yes, we have an advocacy committee that is statewide, and we're watching this very closely and talking to the legislatures about, how it's going to impact affordable housing. Not make it very affordable.
Yeah.
Yeah, affordable housing goals are in direct competition with energy policy. There's no question that they are out of balance in terms of achieving something that finds the middle road.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if you consider adding $39,000 to the cost of the house, and let's say $1,000 at 4% interest rate affects a payment by about $12 a month, $39,000 affects a house payment about $190 a month. So that disqualifies a number of people. The BIAW estimates that every $1,000 eliminates 2,500 people from qualifying for a mortgage. That's a big number. So if we're talking $39,000 cost impact, we're taking 95,000 consumers out of the housing market.
Mm-hmm. I see Randy has turned his video on. Hi, Randy. Good morning.
Good morning.
He leads the county's long-term housing solutions committee, and of course, the county has been working very hard with all sorts of stakeholders to try to begin to take a bite out of our affordable housing issue in our county. Can you shed some light on this, Randy, and how you see this might impact Clallam County citizens and groups that are trying to create more housing units?
First of all, thank you, Greg. I appreciate the input again. And as Greg very well stated, the fact is that we have, every time the building code changes, and as he also stated, it's a continuum. I think Nathan also mentions that. So you're always in a state of flux. That's an issue. And of course, the supply chain is another issue. My issue when I think about affordability, I may not have my numbers right, but the code changes like 2 times ago added about, for a moderate sized house, added about $15,000 if I recall. And then the last changes were maybe another 15,000. And Greg, I hear what you're saying now. This group of changes may add another almost $40,000. So it's in direct conflict with affordability. And I would just tell, I think many people here understand, we've made this presentation to our representatives and senator more than once to try to say, let's balance. I understand carbon's an issue, and I get that, but is that really the place we need to go to get the best return for our dollar? And we keep doing one-offs in all kinds of places, and it may not actually make a lot of logical sense. And I would tell you from an affordability standpoint, and dollars are limited. I mean, for all of us, even when we talk about affordable housing and what we can do with the various tax revenues to help, suddenly another $40,000 to a house just makes it that much more unaffordable for a lot of people. And it's whether it's Peninsula housing or Habitat or just the builder trying to produce a moderate priced home. I've got to tell you, this is a quandary. I think, Colleen, you and I've had this conversation that they don't seem to recognize, or a lot of people don't. And I don't have a solution. And maybe Greg does. That's why I would appreciate it if he would tell me how we're going to overcome some of this, because it doesn't seem to happen. So
yeah, it is frustrating, because when you think about the social impact of pricing people out of housing, it's not just the cost of the housing. The fact is, when the cost of housing increases, the cost of rents increase as well. And it's like in the Swim School District, we have over 200 kids that are technically homeless. And so this kind of initiative exacerbates an already serious problem. The social impacts have to be costing the state a lot of money. And so the state is hurting itself beyond just the issue of achieving more housing. It's increasing expenditures to take care of social problems that result from displacement that people feel when they can't, they have to move out of a rental because the rent went up. And we're already, the BIAW estimates, BIAW is Building Association of Washington, estimates the housing shortage in quantity, in a number, is about 250,000 homes. And so catching up with that demand is made much more difficult by these kinds of new proposals that the legislature is considering today. I don't know what the hurry is.
Mm-hmm. I see Jim McIntyre has his hand up. Jim?
Here, Greg or Nathan or Randy or anybody really, I'm ignorant on these 2 questions I wanted to ask. I know the legislature isn't required by any internal rule to do a cost benefit analysis of legislation such as this. I know that when a state agency does an administrative rule, as I'm assuming the Building Code Council must, when they turn this legislation into an administrative rule and place it in the WAC, that they're required to do some small business impact analysis and so on and so forth. Is there a trigger for the costs, the pain versus the gain? In other words, when the Building Code Council turns this into a rule? And is there a threshold amount there that says you can't do a rule because the pain is worse than the gain? So that's question one. And question two, from a county aspect, you know, that in my mind, at least, there's a relationship between the cost of a home and the median household income. If the median household income doesn't rise in concert with home building costs or the cost of buying a home, if the gap either widens or stays the same, and as you mentioned, Greg, there's a mortgage qualification sliding scale here as home prices go up, that forces families into the rental market because they have no choice but to go there. They can't afford a mortgage. They can't qualify for a mortgage. So that puts additional pressure on the rental market. Increasing demand, limited supply equals rents that go up. Has there been any analysis done of the existing gap between median household income and average cost of a home, either used or new, to figure out what the gap is there? You know, what is the condition of the real estate choices that somebody at the median household income level has right now? Can we put some numbers to this?
Well, the answer to your first question is I am not aware of any threshold that says that legislation is impractical. I just don't think that's there. In terms of your second point, the statewide statewide, the median price is around $550,000. To buy a house with 20% down, under that scenario, requires an income of about $110,000. Now, obviously, those kinds of parameters are more difficult to achieve in a county like ours because we don't come anywhere near that income threshold. But even here in Sequim, we're building 1,400 square foot houses, 1,500 square foot houses, and they're still priced a little over $500,000. So the reason it's sustainable in Sequim is because we're an in-migration market. So the people are coming from other higher value markets and moving to Sequim. Port Angeles is certainly a different scenario because it's more wage-based market, and so it impacts Port Angeles much more severely than it impacts Sequim. But the fact of the matter is, to have a $112,000 income as a minimum to buy a house, the median priced house, is a statewide problem. And my point here in this overall conversation is, why are we in such a hurry to make it worse?
Mm-hmm. Yes. I was just looking through the report that the legislature provides on the Senate bill. So it's the engrossed substitute House Bill 1770 now. And one thing they brought up, which is a really good point, is that if this is adopted, there's going to be a huge demand suddenly for people to install photovoltaic equipment. And I don't know that our current residential and commercial electrical contractors have that staffing on board and trained up, ready to go. So
we also don't have the vendors.
Okay, yeah.
So we don't have the vendors, we don't have the material. If all of a sudden every house in the state of Washington has to have this equipment installed, it's definitely going to be an issue.
Well, for entrepreneurs out there, Rick Dickinson, this would probably be a great thing to start working on, becoming a distributor of this kind of equipment locally. Okay, also, so just to clarify, this is only residential. This would not apply to retail or industrial. It would be multifamily, and is that right? Am I reading that correctly?
No, it applies to commercial.
It does. Okay. Okay. And so is it, that's interesting. So if the port were to build something, then is the photovoltaic requirements, is that based on square footage? I know there's new laws about anyway, bills, I don't know if they've passed for buildings greater than, I think it's 50,000 square feet. But, how do they determine, what if the space is supposed to be storage?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that because I'm not a commercial guy, but that is a great question.
Yeah, okay. Okay, well, does anyone else have any comments or questions? We've got quite a bit of time here. Go ahead, Greg.
I think as a call to action, what I would hope is that people listening in today take the initiative to contact our senator's office and make their opinion known on this. And the more that we can influence that, the better chance we have to, stall this.
Well, so it hasn't come out of committee yet. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. And I understand it did pass through the House. I think it was 51 to 47.
It was pretty close, yeah. I think that's right.
I was texting with Mike Chapman a few days ago, and he told me he voted no on it. I don't know how Representative Theringer voted on it, but here's the link to the report that basically talks about, this is to the Senate Committee on the Environment, Energy, and Technology, and it's their report for the act relating to strengthening energy codes. And I believe this bill was sponsored and written by Senator, I think it was Nguyen, if I remember correctly. I could be wrong on that, but and it was in part written because the governor requested the bill, and trying to, we have really strong laws in our state, especially now with the latest climate change acts that were passed last year. And so I'm just wondering about if it does, I don't know, it does seem to me, I try not to comment and provide too much editorial, but it does seem to me if they haven't stated what the positive impacts will be, it seems they ought to be evaluating, we've got the cost, what will it provide to not just the average household, new home that's built, the reduction in carbon emissions, but more so if they can show what those impacts will be across the state, which I know is more difficult, but it really affects different areas differently. And yeah, so.
Colleen, just a
Yes.
real quick note. I just looked at the, excuse me, the Senate floor calendar. It's out of Senate rules and it's on the bill list for consideration on the floor. So, it's not plugged up someplace. It's actually on the calendar. So who knows whether it'll actually get debated on the floor. That's an open question, but it's out of Senate rules.
Okay.
That must have just happened.
Yeah, I don't know. This was the Senate floor calendar dated yesterday. It's not updated for today, so I'm not sure exactly when it went to the floor, but it's on the, it is at least in the queue for consideration by the full Senate.
So we do have Craig Fulton on with Veneer Construction, who does work in the commercial realm. Craig, have you looked at this bill to determine how it would impact different commercial projects? And again, so it goes into effect on what day, Greg?
Well, it first has to pass the Senate, then the
Right.
governor has to sign it, and then it
Right.
goes to, the committee to develop the rules.
But once those
The
rules,
building code council.
if it passes, what day would those rules go into effect?
That would be determined by the building code council.
Oh, it's not like July 1st, 2023 or
The
something.
date can't be set until they come up with the requirements.
Okay, okay. But I would guess there'd be a rush of activity, all sorts of permits being
Yeah.
issued or applied for rather, right before it would go into effect.
Yeah, an example, before the last code change, I submitted 20 building permits at one time. And that's highly unusual for me, but the impact that Randy Johnson referred to on the last code cycle was more like a $20,000 cost. And so we decided to spend the money. We submitted all the permits to the city of Sequim, and I know a couple of other builders did the same. So it was a rush, and I would expect another one based on this proposal.
Mm-hmm. That makes it kind of hard on the city staff too, you know.
It sure does.
Yeah. Uh-huh. All right, well,
Colleen, also to your question about the effective date, I just looked at the bill summary. The bill, assuming it's passed and signed by the governor, comes into effect 90 days after the governor signs it, presumably. And so then as Greg said, the building code council goes to work and fashions the administrative rules that puts it into effect.
but we don't know what date those would go into effect.
No.
Okay, there'd presumably be a mad rush to get
Yeah.
permits in, especially for those that are that do, you know, multiple homes and the like.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have a comment.
Yes, please.
So I don't always chime in. Some of you know me, some of you don't. I've been a builder since Tim Allen had home improvement. I've been helping people build their houses and get up and running for their life ahead for a long time. So the way I look at this, it takes 1,000 people to make a pencil, from the rubber tree farmer, the tree cutter, all the way down to the guy that tapes and ships the box. If you think it takes 100,000 or 10,000 people in that line to make an appliance from the same theory as the pencil, if you're building a house, if you use that same theory, you have 100,000 people it takes to build and machine and make everything in the food chain to make Greg's houses, from the carpet to the paint, all the way down to the tree cutter, the guy that works on the log truck. Nobody in that food chain, and I don't think any of us are going to say America needs affordable housing, we'll all work cheaper. It's not going to get affordable. Something has to break before it changes. So that's my chime in. Sorry for the, it's quite an eye-opening event if you think about it that way.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Brad. So let's see, we are at 8:46, so we have a little bit of time here. And I see some city council members on on as well. Is anyone interested in making comment from your perspective for your city? Either Lindsay or Lowell? Okay, if not,
Sorry, I was,
oh, go ahead.
This is a great conversation. I really appreciate it. Hi, everyone. This is Sherman Warren from City of Peninsula City Council. I know Nathan spoke earlier about some of the issues. A few things that come to mind from this conversation for me. One is that we are, the transportation system and the housing system are very much connected. And that's obvious in these building changes where you have to plan for having an electric vehicle that would plug into the house, having that separate panel. You know, how much are we thinking of that as an individual thing where every house is going to have a car, as has been the traditional model? Or are we going to be looking at newer models where, say, an apartment building has a car that's shared by all the residents? That's something that started to happen in other places. That could happen in neighborhoods and other spaces as well. So for me, I kind of try to think of it as yes, the state is moving in the direction of zero carbon, but also how do we create a low energy use urban space and not just the high energy use urban space that we have now, just converted to electricity rather than, well, electricity from renewable sources rather than electricity from fossil fuels. So, you know, I think there's some really important points too about prioritizing, you know, just prioritizing the carbon reduction over all other factors. The example of a roof that doesn't get good solar gain because of trees nearby is a great example. What we need instead is the ability for people to invest in solar and not necessarily have the right roof to put it on. Right now, you have to have the interest in doing that. You have to have the capital up front, and you have to have the right roof. How can we separate those three things from each other so that maybe somebody who rents is like, hey, I've got the money, I want to invest in solar, and there's a space for them to do that and invest in our community. But overall, the other comment about, you know, these being well-paid jobs, and we want these good jobs in our community, we should remember that. We should be pushing for the state to say, to provide the incentives, provide the resources for us to have more good jobs in rural places, repairing and fixing our built environment. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Lindsay. Good comments. So Patty, you had a comment or question.
Well, I have a comment. Being a realtor, I have sold many numerous pieces of land recently for people to build a home on. And I can just tell you what a struggle to even try to come up with the funds to build a home now. Going from nice to have down to minimal, it is so exorbitant that it's nearly impossible for anyone to have a home at this point. I can't even imagine what we would call affordable because it certainly isn't today. And I think we've got to look at ways that we can reduce those costs. I'm not against solar. I actually deployed the solar program for Tucson Electric Power 30 years ago. And that program rolled out based on who wanted solar, some incentives to do solar. It was a rollout, not a mandate. And to me, solar is an option. In Arizona, we struggle to make solar work where there's sun all the time. So it doesn't fit every specific need. It's great for hot water. PUD has a program and has it for years. It would be interesting to see how much energy has been sold back to PUD off of the existing solar systems in our area, because there's quite a lot of them. But that to me right now is an option that should be available for people and not a mandate. I think that's serious consequences, adding additional costs on the homes that people can't afford to build at the moment. And we're in serious trouble, I think, in our county with affordable homes. It's just my concern.
I I know you're pretty familiar with the Clallam PUD. Also, one impact that this will have, and this is, I'm not commenting either way to say positive or negative, but just something to recognize, as we reduce the amount of energy usage in our built environment, we also, that means that there is less energy demand for the city of Port Angeles electrical utilities and the Clallam PUD electrical utilities, and their costs certainly are not going down. So presumably that those expenses would need to be shared with the older housing, and which would mean those costs would go up. Is that a fair evaluation?
I agree. I think there needs to be a cost analysis, and I certainly haven't heard anything related to this bill that would look at those factors, all of the factors around this type of a requirement. But I'd say it's very significant. I understand we want to, get the renewables out there. I understand that, but we can't do it by just mandating certain things, because they're economic impacts far reaching for it, in my opinion.
Okay. Does anyone have any further comments? If not hearing any, I think this has been a robust discussion, and we really appreciate everyone joining. Greg, thank you so much for spending some time with us today and talking about House Bill 1770 from a builder and developer's perspective. We'll wait and see to hear whether this passes and whether it gets a vote on the Senate floor. So it did go through rules, is that what you said, Jim? And it's now on the floor?
Yeah, it's as of yesterday's floor list, it's on the Senate floor calendar, so it's been pulled from rules to the floor.
Okay.
As I say, who knows, being on the floor calendar doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be either voted on, or if it's voted on, if it passes. But at least it's beyond the rules committee. It's not stuck. That's the point. It's not stuck.
And I'm sure it would be signed by the governor if
yeah, he requested the bill, so I'm sure he's going to sign it.
Okay, well, thank you, everyone. With that, it's 8:54, and we'll be back on next week with Josh Weiss. He'll give us a recap. That's the day before Sign Die. So we will, he'll be giving us a recap on what's happened in the short session of the legislature for 2022. So I hope you'll be able to join us. And, there's so many different bills and so many different realms. So you can ask him questions about a particular issue that you may be concerned about. So thanks, everyone, and we'll see you next Wednesday. Bye-bye.
Yeah.